Hey, I'm joined here today with Marc Matthews. Really excited for this. He runs the Inside the Mix podcast, which I've been listening to and enjoying a lot here lately. And so I'm curious to dive into this conversation and talk about production, mixing, and just songwriting and workflow in general. So, Marc, how are you doing? And tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started with production and Inside the Mix.
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for asking, and thank you for inviting me on the podcast as well, on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, so I started. It's quite a long story, to be honest. So I'm not going to bore the listeners too much with how it all began. But I was in a metal band for a number of years, throughout my 20s, for probably about 8 years. Actually, I was in a metal band, and yeah, it was really good fun. And I think, have you disappeared from the?
Yeah, I can change the layout here. I'm
Oh,
still
okay.
here.
That's
I should have
I
warned
thought
you.
you disappeared then for a minute. Then I was like, oh, is it just me?
I was just really bored, so I checked out.
It's a good
No,
start.
yeah, I can here in the software I can like change the layout and stuff. So when
Right,
you're
right,
talking,
right.
I'll focus on you and stuff.
Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, you can see the mess behind me in the studio here. I really need to tidy it up. I've been too busy of late.
Yeah, I
So
got I
yeah,
got mess too, but I just make sure it's outside the camera.
yeah, I really need to sort it out. I could do like a backdrop here to get rid of it all.
Hey,
All the business, all
that's
the
a
interesting
sign.
stuff's that way.
Yeah, that's a sign of the most creative, geniuses, is that they have a messy
Well, that's
environment,
good.
right? I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
So
You can
we'll go
probably
with
see
that.
I got like a cup of soup on the side there. Anyway, yeah. So I was in a metal band for a number of years, for about eight to 10 years, and I played guitar. And during that process, I went and recorded albums and released those albums. So we recorded with some pretty good engineers. Carl Groomth in our studios, who's done notable albums with sort of like Threshold and Dragon Force. So that was all really good fun. And then it kind of inspired me to then learn about the creation process. So as much as I liked being on stage and performing and whatnot, I wanted to actually, I was kind of watching and observing and thinking, actually, I want to know how you're doing that. What are you doing there to create those sounds and put this piece together? So I then went and I went down the academic route and I studied a degree. I got a master's degree in music engineering and production, which was great. I actually thoroughly enjoyed my time doing it. One thing I did learn from that was, I think this is probably a sweeping statement, but I think that with academia, I think having a portfolio could possibly be. This is a topic that I ask a lot of engineers who've been in the industry a lot. And what is your preference between sort of a portfolio of work or the academic route? And I personally, I think in hindsight, a portfolio would have been better. But I thoroughly enjoyed my time. And then I sort of moved on to music production and started producing and mixing, mastering other artists' work as well as my own, because I released music under my own name, having left the band. And then I decided one day I was listening to another podcast, and they were and the idea was they said, like, start your own podcast to promote your own music. And I was like, all right, I'll give that a go. And that was about 2.5 years later, not realizing the admin and the work that goes into creating a podcast. But it's been great. I mean, the amount of people I've got to speak to that I wouldn't otherwise meet in general. And also, I'm talking to some really high profile mix engineers who are giving their time, dedicating their time for the podcast. I'm able to ask them questions. So I'm sort of like learning from them. Almost, I'm getting free education ultimately from these top engineers who otherwise are extremely busy. So there's that. And obviously that then cascades down through the podcast to the listeners as well. And then obviously there's the tutorial aspect. So I do music production, exemplar tutorials through that as well. And obviously we invite artists on now to play their own music and we critique it as well, which is extremely popular. So it's sort of grown from what was essentially a 2-week interview platform to a weekly interview, Kickstarter, music critique, tutorial podcast now, and it's growing and growing, which is amazing, and it's enabled me to connect with people like yourself, like we're doing today, which I probably wouldn't have otherwise done. So that's essentially how I got to where I am now, and then I'm just in this messy studio right now, working on my own music and other people's music as well. So it's a joy.
That's so cool. Yeah, I mean, I thought that might be more valuable even than like going to school, is actually getting to talk to, obviously they can't like show you like didactically like what they're doing, but being able to interview all these people, that's really amazing that you can do that. And right? People are actually doing it, actually in the game, in the field,
Mhm.
actually doing things. So like, what have been like maybe some real eye-opening things you've learned from interviewing all these different people? Anything that's really stood out? Maybe just like 2 or 3 things that, as kind of maybe you didn't know before, that's really made a big difference for you in your own work.
I think for me, the biggest one, and I mention this a lot when I'm talking to other, when I do the producer Kickstarter ones, where individuals come onto the podcast, artists, musicians, and they have their pain points, and then I'll give them advice, and we hash out how they could overcome those pain points. But the biggest one I got from Don Morley, who is a mix engineer and producer as well, so he's a Grammy award-winning one, and it was to do with balance. And it's not something that I was doing frequently in my workflow before, which was the idea that you have your recording, whatever it may be, and then you create a balanced mix first. So you balance everything before you then go in and actually do the mixing process.
Right. So
And I wasn't
volume
doing that.
balancing, right? Is that
Yeah,
what you
yeah,
mean by?
yeah, exactly that. And before I would start with my foundation of the drums without doing this balance. And I'm finding now that I do the balance first, it's streamlined the process. It makes it so much easier because I've got this foundation that I can then work from. So that was probably one of the biggest. I don't want to use the word game changer because I see it a lot online. Like everything's a game changer, everything's a silver bullet. But it sort of revolutionized my workflow, and it's quite a simple thing to do. But I'd always be like, oh, that's it. I'm going to dig straight into this mix, and I'm going to start with the foundation of the drums, and then I'm going to move on. But whereas now I sort of come up with this balance, and that includes panning as well. So it's not only sort of level in terms of volume of the instruments, but also panning, putting that panning in there, and then I can go in and then do all the other bits and pieces that I want to do. I would have edited it first, and then I can go in and use automation to. I use automation a lot. It's like Spaghetti Junction. You look at it; it's like the London Underground when you look at
Yeah.
a mix of mine. It's crazy, but
Yeah. It's
I
cool to
get
show
lost in it.
people pictures of that because it makes you look like you know what you're doing. Like, look at all these lines.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's complicated. I know what I'm doing.
yeah. Well, exactly. Yeah, it's like, oh, he must know what he's doing. He's got
Yeah.
all this stuff going on. But yeah, I put a picture up on, was it a story on Instagram recently, and I was just like, yeah, here it is, and it was the vocals for this song that I'm working on at the moment, and I was just like, man, it literally is just like the London Underground. It's crazy, but it works. So that would probably be the biggest one, and the other one would be probably from another interview that I did. I can't remember the engineer off the top of my head. It might have been Adrian Hall. It could well have been. It was around that time. And he mentioned about being bold with your EQ decisions. And at the time, this was quite poignant because I was seeing a lot of videos on TikTok in particular, and they were having these, like, you'd have an EQ of a vocal, and then they were just carving out these little notches in this vocal of like with a Q of about 2.5, 2 dB, and it looked like a comb by the end of it. And then I spoke to Adrian. Yeah. And he was kind of like, nah, just be bold, man. Just be bold with your decisions and do these broad EQ strikes. Now, obviously, that's a sweeping statement. It's not going to work for everything. But having done that, I think, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Just be bold with it. I mean, it's music at the end of the day. It's a creative medium. And if it sounds good, once again, big cliche, then it is good. So that was probably the other bit of information. And there's one other bit, actually, as well. This is from Mike Exeter, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath. And he said, this was about the low end. And there's a tendency to use really steep slopes to roll off low end frequencies of like a bass guitar or a distorted guitar or something along those lines. And his sort of retort to that was, that energy is there for a reason. So don't get rid of it without thinking. Do it in the context of the mix and do it for a purpose. Don't just do it because that energy could contribute to the mix. Now, I'm not saying leave it all in there because you might get a muddy mess, but use not so steep slopes. So I use 6 dB slopes or less. So like first order slopes or less when I'm doing that. And that was another big thing as well. And that sort of has really helped that low end tonal balance across the whole track. So those are probably the 3 top tips that I've got.
That's really good. Yeah. And that's kind of probably inside of there. I found maybe like one more kind of big overarching tip is don't just do things just because, right? Or don't do it because you saw someone do it. Use your ears and actually listen and make sure you're adding something because you have an actual intention and a purpose behind it. I feel like that's a little bit of a catch-22 for me for beginners who haven't really developed their hearing as well. So it's like you want these quick tips that you see someone doing, and so you just try to copy them to get it close because you haven't really developed your hearing yet. So I don't know, do you have any tips on how, as a beginner, to go about developing your critical listening so you can hear better and make intentional decisions instead of just not having the confidence to make your own choices?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point, because it is quite easy to, like you say, you can, a classic one is that you see someone will post a video and saying, if you're EQing a male vocal, then you need to roll off this frequency. You need to boost here for body. You need to cut here to get rid of nasal. You need to boost here for presence and boost here for some air. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you're in the right ballpark, but ultimately it depends on the vocal itself. You might have a male vocalist who's got an incredibly high voice. Or they might be a baritone, and it might be even further down the octave range. But I think I say this a lot, and I'm quite amazed actually the amount of people that don't use reference tracks, but use a reference and compare what you're doing. Listen to songs that you really like and are good productions as well, good productions. I'll listen to the tonal balance and the quality of those mixes, and in doing so you'll start to pick out, okay, I can see or I can hear that male female vocal sounds like that in this frequency range. Okay, it's kind of similar to mine. I'm going to try and match them and see how it pans out and see. And what you want to do is you want to start to identify the different frequency ranges and how, if you manipulate them, how it affects that tonal, that character, that timbre of the instrument. So I think my big tip is references. I've got a Spotify playlist which is literally just called EP references at the moment, because I'm creating an EP for myself in my spare time. But yeah, references. I think references are a really, really good starting point to start to work out what sounds or what you should be or what it should sound like. It's great for balance as well. So if you haven't got an idea of where the kick and the snare should sit in a mix, have a track in your DAW at the top and then just stick a reference in there. What I would then say is make sure that you use a gain plugin and reduce the output so it matches approximately the output from your mix, because the classic everything sounds better when it's louder sort of thing happens then. But yeah, my top bit of advice would be sort of critical listening of references and A/Bing against your own.
Yeah, I do that. Yeah, that's really a really huge tip there. That's something I do as well. And I'm going to even like create a new album or a new song. I'll have like a playlist for production ideas too, because what I've learned is really a big part of mixing, having a good mix, comes from actually the arrangement as well. Because if you have a bad arrangement, you have all these sounds clashing, doesn't matter how good of a mixer you are, things are going to be overlapping and it's not going to sound clear and clean. So even production wise, that could be a part of it too. Maybe you're not struggling. Maybe like you think you're doing a good job mixing, you know what you're doing mixing, like why doesn't it sound right? Could actually be the arrangement.
I think there's a really, I was just about to say that's a really, really good point. And it's something I experienced earlier myself when I was working on this track, and it got towards the end and I've got lead guitar, I've got distorted guitar, I've got some synths, I've got everything going on. And I was just like, oh man, it sounds really cluttered. There's too much going on here. So one thing I tell a lot of individuals is like, if that happens, mute everything and gradually bring in each instrument group until you get to the point whereby it sounds cluttered, and then start to, or I suppose you don't need to do that. You can start to mute instrument groups, and ultimately what you want to do is just get rid of the stuff that's not contributing. So I had 2 guitars and they were 2 clean guitars in this section, and they were there, but I took them out and it's not noticeable and it just cleaned up the entire mix. So I think the key thing here is, and I've mentioned this on the podcast, on the Inside the Mix podcast as well, is to improve an arrangement. Don't necessarily think you have to add to it. Like it could be a case of you need to take away, you need to remove, you need to have a bit of night and day, a bit of binary, ones and zeros. You need to get rid of stuff. So that's a key bit as well. I think it's quite easy to think, okay, this mix isn't quite working, so I'm just going to chuck another synth in there, or I'm going to chuck another sound effect in there. But sometimes it might be that you need to take stuff out, because as I mentioned there, like when I had these guitars going, everything's got to have a space, and there's only so much space you have between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. for you to squeeze all this stuff in. And the more you have, the more you're going to have to juggle and carve out space for. So that would be my key bit of advice there is if the mix isn't quite working, as you mentioned there, look at the arrangement and think, actually, is this contributing? If it's not, just get rid of it.
That's really good. So yeah, a lot of time, yeah, I find that increasingly less is more. Have you found that to be the case with just the song production process in general? Because you've got all this gear, all these plugins, right, all these presets. Like, have you found that actually setting limitations can be your friend when it comes to production or mixing? And if so, how, like, what limitations do you set for yourself when it comes to being creative and creativity?
Yeah, I totally do. I think limitations are great. And I am not one for, it's quite easy to have like shiny object syndrome and be like a magpie. And every time somebody says, this goes back to what I said earlier about game changer plugins. And every time somebody posts saying, oh, I've got this plugin, you need to check it out. Because you're going to get it. You sign up for something, you get an email and they release a new plugin. You think, oh man, I need to put that into my workflow. But you don't. I think this goes back to a conversation I had with, Michael Oakley about this time last year, I think it was, and he's got like 2 or 3 synths, and he'll go into these synths and he'll star or favorite all his favorite patches. So that way, this helps workflow. He knows immediately he can just filter via his favorite bass sounds, and he's not spending loads of time going through all these different bass patches trying to find the perfect one. So that's another way of where limitations are great. I think time limitations as well, because I think mixing, you can go into binge editing, binge mixing, and you could sit there and you could tweak a snare and you could move it up 5.5 dB, you can move it down 0.5 dB, but ultimately you're probably the only person who knows you've done that, and maybe somebody who's got incredibly tuned ears and is picking up for it. Because you've got to think as well, where is the listener listening to the music? Are they going to be listening to it in a critical listening environment? Some maybe, but for the most part, they're going to be streaming it via their phone on a pair of headphones as well. So I think limitations are great. I work with them all the time. I have plugins. I do have a range of plugins, but I find myself reverting back more and more to the stock plugins. I use Logic for mixing now. I moved over from Pro Tools when I left the recording and just moved into just mixing. And I use a lot of the dynamic plugins in Logic. I use the EQ as well. I think the EQ is great. And I use a lot of free plugins. So I'm moving more into using free plugins. For example, today I found
I was going to ask, what are some of your favorite free plugins?
Yeah. I love the TDR Nova EQ. I think that's great. It's a really nice, smooth sounding EQ. And I think it's great. It's got a great interface as well. There's the Ignite Amps Pultec EQ. I think it's called literally PTEQ or something like that, and it's phenomenal. I absolutely love it. Like you got to be careful with it because a lot goes a long way with that EQ. But I think it's great. It's great to use in mastering and mixing. That's free. The TDR Kotelnikov mastering compressor is another really good one as well. I use that in every mastering session. It creeps up somewhere, it pops up somewhere. I discovered another one today, which was Sonobus, and this is a great one for your audience, and it is a way for you to stream your audio from your DAW to your phone via the internet, or in my instance, a local area network. So I can stream it to my phone and then play from my DAW through my phone, and then I Bluetoothed it out to a mono Bluetooth speaker for auditioning. Once again, it's just streamlining that process of auditioning. I'm not having to bounce out the song, upload it to Dropbox, listen to it on my phone. I could just stream directly from my DAW using Sonobus, and it's a standalone plugin as well. So that's one I found today, and I started using today, and it's really good. The last one I would say is the Good Hertz Midside Matrix, which is a really good plugin to use when you're trying to, if you've got a bit of disparity between the stereo width and the mono signal, the mono content of your mix, and you want to sort of adjust them. That's a really good one to go for as well.
That's really good. I've never heard of that one where you can actually, monitor through your phone or some other device.
Really good.
That's really cool. Could you talk maybe a little bit more about that? Like you mentioned, like not everyone's going to be listening in an ideal listening environment, so it's important to test in the real world, right, on devices that people are going to be listening to. Why is that so important? And what are you listening for when you're listening, say, in your car or through your iPhone or your iPhone speakers, your laptop, whatever? What are you listening for when you're listening on those systems?
Yeah, I mean, I don't listen in my car anymore. The car test is a classic one, but I don't do it anymore. But I think
I
mainly, like,
sadly can't because my car doesn't have Bluetooth. My car's so old.
yeah, well,
So,
mine is as well. It's got an auxiliary cable, and I'm too lazy to plug it all in, and then my phone hasn't got an auxiliary out, and I'm like, sod it. I'm not going to go down that route. But
yeah. Sometimes I feel like, am I a real producer if I can't do the car test?
there's plugins now where you can emulate it, but I don't go down that route. But what you're looking for really is, particularly on like a phone or a laptop. Saying that though, the new MacBook laptops are really good, the sound that comes out of them. But it's that
Yeah.
mid-range. It's clarity in the mid-range, because you're not going to get those low frequencies and you're going to lose some of the high frequencies. But if you've got clarity in the mid-range, because that's where our ears are most sensitive, around that sort of that mid-range of between 2 and 4 up to 6K, depending on your age, I think, possibly. But that's where you want clarity, and that's what you're looking for when you're auditioning on those systems, is that those mid-range frequencies. So can you hear the snare? Can you hear the vocal? Obviously, if it's a vocal track, then the vocal is going to be running the track. Can you hear it, or can you hear everything? Is it nicely balanced there? What else do I audition on? I audition between two different sets of heads. So I got these Audio Technicas, and I got another pair of focal ones as well, which sound incredibly different to these ones, but they're really good. They're closer to what you would imagine it to sound like if you're listening through just a standard set of everyday headphones. And then I listen on a set of Apple AirPods as well. And once again, it's a case for me when I'm listening is I sort of know the characteristics now of all those different listening environments. So I know, for example, I've got these Bluetooth in ears as well, and I know they are extremely harsh in the high end. And then if I put a song on there and I know it's going to sound harsh, but I kind of know how it should sound, if that makes sense. So this goes back to a conversation I had with Elaine Rasnick, who's a mastering engineer, a couple of weeks ago. And she said, you kind of want to spend that time critically listening via those different platforms that you're going to use and start to get attuned to them, so you know what they should sound like, if that makes sense. It's a bit of a laborious process, but it's certainly worth doing, because that way you'll know, okay, I know this should sound like this on this setup, and it doesn't, and then you can go back and tweak your mix.
So that goes back to references probably, and listen to other tracks on those same systems and then compare it to yours. And how does the mid-range sound? How does the high end or the low end that is present, how does that sound on that system? And does it match?
Yeah,
up?
exactly.
Is it clear? Can you hear everything? Okay. And you mentioned Michael Oakley. I really like his music. I'm a big fan of Synthwave. I know you've interviewed a couple of Synthwave artists like Pensacola Mist and Simon Quinn of the Safety Word. He's actually a student of my Synthwave course. How did you end up interviewing all these different Synthwave artists? Is that something that you're interested in, or are you interviewing like all kinds of genres? Or
the podcast started out as like specifically for synth artists, and it kind of like it does still revolve around that, because the music I release is sort of synth. I wouldn't say it's synthwave, but it's synth pop, and it's kind of like an amalgamation of my own influences, some of your parts and all that. And the podcast basically started out with me reaching out to these artists and saying, hey, I got this podcast. Would you like to jump on and discuss your music processes and music production and stuff? And that's how it sort of started. And then I reached out to Michael, and he was kind enough to jump on the podcast and chat about, because he's got a lot of sample packs and he does a lot of work in that realm as well.
Right. Yeah, I really like his sample pack for Baby Audio's new synth plugin, the BA1.
I haven't tried that yet. Is it any good?
Yeah, I really like it a lot.
Yeah, I haven't tried it yet.
It's really easy way to pull up some really good classic synth sounds, and from what I've used it for.
Fantastic. Yeah, I need to get on that. There was one actually synth I saw the other day that I really want to get, and it's the Emulation 2. I think it's called the Emulation 2, which is an emulation of the Emulator 2. But that's a total tangent there. But yeah, so I was just reaching out to them. So I reached out to Michael, for example, and then reached out to so I had Ed Sunglasses Kid on just before he blew up, basically, on Instagram. Yeah. And I was chatting with him the other day, actually, and hopefully we're going to get him back on, because it'd be great to chat with him about everything that's happening, because it's huge. Pensacola Mist have been on a couple of times. I love their music. I think they're fantastic. The Martin Brothers, I really enjoyed that one. Those dudes are super talented, and their style of like synth music's like they're quite close to the stuff that I do and I like. But yeah, I just reached out to them, really. It's more so now that I'm doing less interviews now, than I was when I started, because now it's sort of like interviews. There are production tutorial episodes, and then I've got the producer kickstart. So any of your audience listening, if they want to jump on the podcast with a pain point for 20 minutes and discuss it, and also you get the opportunity to give yourself a shout out on the podcast as well.
That's really cool.
Yeah, head over to insidethemixpodcast.podia.com. I need to get rid of that Podia bit. It's a website under construction.
Yeah, I used Podia in the past.
Yeah. That's. I need to get rid of that. I need to make the jump and do the paid version. But yeah, so you're kind of moving away from interviews as such. And I think the interviews that I'm going to be doing now are more like audio engineer, mix engineer, mastering engineer, actually specialists in a particular sector. And then I've got the producer kickstart episodes, which is whereby artists can come on, play their music, and then we critique them. So I have a maximum of 5 artists. They jump on the podcast. They have 30 seconds to play a piece of music, and then we offer feedback on it, basically. And that's really popular. It's a really popular episode format.
That's really cool. I might have to do something like that.
Yeah, I recommend it. It's really, really good. It's I do it once a month, although I'm taking a break this month because it's summer. But we go live on YouTube every 4 weeks with it. And it's really, really popular. It's really good fun.
Awesome. So then going back to the synth artists, I asked that question earlier. Just in general, those production techniques that you learned from interviewing all these people, I guess I'll ask the same question again. Like, is there 1 or 2 really big things you've learned from interviewing these synthwave artists that apply to creating synth pop music specifically, that goes a long way towards making great synth pop music?
Yeah, I think from a mixing point of view, I think there's one really key thing with mixing, and I should have mentioned this earlier actually, is one tip for production, is that when you're panning, if you've got 2 synths and you're panning them left and right, don't use the same patch, the exact same patch on the left and right, because effectively what you're then going to do is it's not going to sum to mono, but they're going to it's going to affect the stereo width. What you want to do is have one patch on the left and then another on the right that's not totally different, but is different. It's got a different sort of timbre to it. It's got a different frequency content to it, because that way it's going to be more obvious and you're going to get this much better stereo width. So that's a big one actually, because I think I should have known this having been in a metal band. And when we double track guitars, the left and right guitars are not the same. We track the left guitar and we track the right guitar, because you're not going to have the exact same performance left and right. And I should have known that, really. I should have taken that into the synth realm, but it wasn't until I had a conversation with someone I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Right. Why am I using the same synth on the left as I am on the right? So mix it up. If you are using the same patch, maybe go in and carve out some frequencies on the left, boost them on the right, or something along those lines.
Right. Add some saturation or something.
Yeah,
change
exactly.
It up a little bit. Yeah,
exactly. Make it different. Otherwise, it's just going to be one big mono. I think it was Adrian Hall said that. He said, "Yeah, if it's the same, it's just going to be
just makes it louder, really. Yeah, it's not really not getting that widening. Yeah,
yeah, and it's the same with vocals as well. When you're tracking vocal, you're not just going to have one vocal and then duplicate it. Well, I suppose you could, and then you could offset it, the timing slightly, and then detune it by a few cents if you're really stuck. If you cannot get another vocal performance, and it's the same with the guitar, but ideally you want to get it right at source. That's another one as well. Getting it correct at source to save you the hassle later on in the mix or the master. But when it comes to actually producing synthwave, I think this is a really good one, and I can't remember who said this, and I do this now more so in my own music, is get to the point quickly. So I think in particular with some music, you can have these incredibly long intros, which is great if you're going down like some sort of progressive piece, and it might be conducive to the music itself, but just get to the, if it's like a radio friendly song, just get to the point really quick. Don't have these prolonged intros, just get to that verse, get to that chorus, keep the listener engaged, keep them hooked. So that's another one. But that being said, it really depends on the song. But I think if you're writing something that is radio friendly, you really want to grab that listener really quickly. And in doing so, just get to the point of the song really quickly, if that makes sense. I hope it does.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, you want to, so this day and age with everyone's short attention spans and everything, you see so many songs now, like under 3 minutes even in total length. Yeah. So that doesn't give you a lot of time for the intro. I think with synthwave music, you have a little bit more leeway, like you see a
Yeah.
little bit longer songs, but it's still the same concept. You still want to apply that to your music.
Yeah, and I think that's where the radio edit, the classic radio edit comes in, doesn't
Mm-hmm.
it? You can have these longer album tracks, and then when you release it as a single, you have the radio edit, which is going to be shorter.
Mm-hmm. Which can be a good idea too, because then you get two songs for the price of one, basically.
Well, this is
more
it.
music.
Yeah. And as an independent artist as well, the more you can eke out from one piece of content, the better, because it is so hard to be a creative and also promote your own music. So this is going off on a total tangent now, but it's the same with the podcast. Is I have one piece of content, which is that long format video, and I need to absolutely rinse it for content as much as I can. Because we only have a finite amount of time, and it's the same with music as well. So that's why the Safety Word are amazing at doing this. Like every release they have like an insane amount of remixes and remix albums. And hats off to Simon. I can't remember the other gentleman's name. Sorry, but they're fantastic at doing it.
Yeah, and he said he wrote like 1,000 songs in a month or something. Am I remembering that wrong?
I think it was a year.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say a month. That's like,
and I was just like, wow. I got loads from that though. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another thing as well when it comes to songwriting, because he talked about barriers to entry to songwriting, and he says to roll a dice with a key to pick your key, which I thought was an amazing idea. You've probably all heard all this. Mm-hmm. And then he said that if you're stuck for chords, use something like Scalar 2. And I have Scalar 2, and I often use it if I've hit a bit of a block, particularly with bass lines. I think Scalar 2 is amazing for coming up with these really, really interesting bass lines. But use the tools available to alleviate any barriers to entry to songwriting. So that was a really good one. That conversation with Simon was really good for that.
Yeah, definitely go listen to that over on Inside the Mix. Do you remember what number that? I mean, you can search through his catalog, but that was a really good one. I definitely recommend that. I can link it. I can link it.
Yeah, if you could do that'd be great. Yeah. I want to say it's in the 60s. I want to say 64, 65. We're at 100 now. So
I mean, again, repurposing content. That's why I'm creating this. This is a podcast that I'm doing, so I can create clips and stuff. So definitely recommend that with your music as well, right? If you can create multiple versions of songs, that's more you have to release, and that's something your fans would find that's really cool, I think, too. And if you like a song, you want to hear it in different ways. Yeah. And speaking of creating a lot of songs and releasing songs, how do you finish more songs? Because it can be, I feel like it's maybe easy to start a song. You get a lot of people get stuck in the 8-bar loop, or even if they get beyond that, actually, to get the whole production together. But how do you actually go about, finishing the mix, actually declaring the song done, because you always feel like there's something you could change. How do you finish more music and actually get a consistent, release stream going?
Yeah, I think from the production side of things, I think the key there is to, and I started this earlier this year, and once again, this comes off that conversation with Simon, was to have a strict songwriting schedule. So that's like every day, Monday to Friday, for 30 minutes a day, I'll songwrite and I'll write something. And I have that I have that EP Spotify song playlist that I use for reference. And I think, I like the sound of that song, and I'm going to use that as influence today. And I think having that schedule every day certainly helps. So just being religious to the point where by every day, you're going to be doing something, you're going to be writing for 30 minutes, even if you don't feel like doing it, and you're not. The thing is, you don't want to wait for inspiration to strike. Just get in there and do it. And you'll find that after a couple minutes, you probably find the inspiration that you want. So that's one thing I would say, is don't wait for inspiration to strike. But another thing to do there is when you're actually mapping out the song itself, if you've got a production, you've got an 8-bar loop, just map it out. So you can imagine you've got your intro, which is 8 bars. You've got your first verse, 16 bars. You've got a chorus, 16 bars. And then you've got another 16 bars, another chorus. And then just map it out like that. And that way, I find that being able to see the song in front of me and where everything sits, or could sit, really helps. Because I can then start to see like an ending point for the song. I'm not saying that's going to be the final structure of the track, but just being able to see how it could flow really helps. And don't get hung up on drum sounds, like finding the perfect snare, the perfect kit during production. Just stick a loop in there. If you've got a track at 120 BPM and you've got a 120 BPM loop, that loosely fits the style you're going for, or even use the inbuilt drummer in Logic and just stick it in there. Don't get hung up on that. And the same with the bass, with your synths as well. Okay, what you want to do is I've just seen a comment come up there. That's amazing. I've never seen that.
Oh, that's a little banner I created when you mentioned, right? Waiting
Amazing.
for inspiration. It made me think of this William Faulkner quote, so I put that in here real quick. So yeah, it says, I only write when inspiration strikes. Fortunately, it strikes at 9 every morning. So
there you go.
That's the difference between the amateur and the professional. Is the professional, they do it whether the inspiration is there or not. And I think when you get started, you find the inspiration comes. I think that's what he was talking about here. That quote.
Yeah, that's what I was saying there is, you got to just get started, and then you'll find that inspiration will hit. It's the classic with anything. It's like this, if you want to quit doing something, they say, I'm not ready to do it. Well, when is going to be the perfect time? Just do it now, and obviously that's easy for me to say, but everybody's situation is different. But going back to what I said there about is the different instruments as well. With Michael Oakley, what he said about having your favorite sounds. So you can immediately go in and find a bass sound because you've got your list of favorite sounds. And I think what also really helps when it comes to production is having a template. For example, I've got a synth pop template, I've got a house template, and I've got a generic template. And I can load that up, and it's got all the instruments in there that I would usually use to write or produce. And I can quickly go in there and start and lay an idea down. So I'm not spending half an hour finding a bass sound. I know, okay, this is my synth pop template. These are the standard bass sounds that I use for just a fretless bass, for example. It's already there. Boom, I can start writing straight away. You're removing barriers that otherwise would stop you from producing or being creative in those 30 minutes. So that's from production. From mixing this goes back to what I said earlier about starting with a balance. And then I would set yourself a time frame. And generally I try and stick to 10 hours or less for a mix. And then at the very least, every 3 hours, I would take a break. And I think that's the best bit of advice I can give, really, is set a time frame, set a deadline for your mix. And you kind of want to know when good is good enough. There's always going to be something that you're going to want to improve or change. I listen to songs that I release now and I'm thinking, I could change that. That vocal's too high there. That bass is a bit rumbly there. That kick's coming through a bit too much. But ultimately, you got to draw a line in the sand and move on. What you don't want to do is have 40, 50 alternate versions of that, which does happen, of that particular mix. It's just that. And also getting feedback as well. Feedback from your peers is incredibly important. But in saying that, just because it's feedback, it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So you got to take the feedback that you think is relative at the same time. So my big one for mixing in particular is setting a deadline and trying your best to stick to it. And using references will help as well.
That was awesome. That was a wealth of value there. So yeah, set deadlines and, eliminate everything that is a barrier to the creation. And I think that's a big thing, because I think a lot of times we're just not self-aware. We might think, I could never do that. I could never create a song that fast. Well, why not? Well, because it takes, I have to find sounds. That takes a while. Well, why does that take a while? Well, because you haven't identified what are your favorite sounds. So a lot of times we just got to take a step back and look at what we're doing, because a lot of times we don't think something is possible. I say, I can't do that. Instead of, we need to think, how might I do that? How might I write songs faster? How might I finish songs faster? So having those templates, identifying your favorite sounds and having those accessible, those are a couple things you can do. So I thought that was really valuable.
Yeah, it's that growth mindset. I used to be a teacher. So I'm a trained teacher as well. And it is that growth mindset. It's kind of like, I can't do that yet. It's having that yet at the end of it. So it's not a case of, like you say, they're looking at, I can't do that. I can't write a song that quickly. You can't do it yet. You can do it. You just got to remove those barriers. And that Sonobus, what I mentioned earlier in mixing, that removes the barrier straight away. You're able to stream via your phone from your DAW. So you're not having to do that bounce, render, upload, blah, blah, blah. You immediately, you can think, cool. I was mixing through my mono Bluetooth speaker here earlier via Sonobus, and it's great. And once again, you're just removing barriers and it just streamlining that process and making it easier for yourself.
Awesome. And so then what if you hit your deadline, your mixing deadline, and you're still not happy with the song? Do you still release it, or do you You spend a
What
little
I
bit more time
Yeah,
mixing
what I
it.
tend to do there is I will put it to bed for a week and I won't listen to it, and then I'll come back to it with a fresh set of ears. And I hopefully at the same time I would have forgotten any inbuilt bias to the song, if that makes sense. So hopefully I would have forgot that, oh, that snare there is not quite right, or that I need to adjust the reverb on the snare during the chorus, or that vocal I need to, I don't know, I need to add a bit of top end to that vocal to give it a bit of air or something along those lines. So hopefully I would have forgotten all that bias in amongst the weekly stuff that I do. But I would put it to bed for a week. And in that week, if you can get some feedback on it as well, would be great. And then come back to it and then do another mix. But when you do that next mix, once again, set yourself a limit, like an hour's limit on a mix revision. Should take any longer than that, really.
That's really good. Yeah, I've seen some people push back and say, well, what about quality? Isn't quality important? But I've found that actually having deadlines and mixing faster produces better quality than giving yourself an endless amount of time because of listening fatigue, because of bias that you get after hearing something so many times. You start to tune things out. You don't notice things as much. So if you give yourself a shorter time frame to mix something, I find it's generally higher quality. What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think what can often happen is the longer you spend on it, the more damage you can do as well.
Yes.
Certainly the more, I remember that I fell into that pitfall. I was mixing a 20 or 30 piece brass band years and years ago, and I was there for ages doing it, and I was like, I just kept going and going and going, and it was just getting worse and worse.
Yeah.
And I wish I just settled on the first mix, and I go back to the initial iteration or the second or third, and I was like, actually that's probably the one. So I think you probably are going to be doing more damage if you just continue to mix and revise and mix and revise, and then maybe just like leave it for a couple of weeks and then come back to it. What you want to try and do is regain some of that objectivity, so you can look at it with a fresh set of ears, or listen to it rather with a fresh set of ears. And yeah, I think going back to what you said there, I think it will oftentimes is. And it goes back earlier to what we said right at the beginning as well, is what you probably end up doing is chucking more stuff at it, trying to fix it. Or you're trying to fix something that
This
doesn't need
track needs a
fixing.
third compressor plugin. This track needs
Yeah,
a fourth
exactly.
EQ plugin.
Yeah, I'm gonna stick another tape saturation emulator on this, or I'm gonna put some parallel compression on this, or and yeah, like going back to what I said then, is you probably just end up adding more to it that you don't need to, and then you just end up with this big mess, which is that's an extreme case, a big mess, but it can happen.
Yeah, it's happened to me.
So I've been there.
Yep. Any last piece of advice that you give to beginner producers that are trying to get to that point where they're producing music that they're proud of and happy with, that sounds like it could be on the radio, professional quality? What's kind of just a big piece of advice you give to someone like that?
My big piece of advice would be, if you can, is to find like a mentor or something along those lines. If you can find one who will be able to point you in the right direction for resources, and that could well be a podcast like Inside a Mix podcast, like Orpheus Audio Academy, you guys, something along those lines, because there is so much information out there. And what you don't want to do is just spend your time watching videos. You actually want to spend your time doing. Don't spend your time passively watching. Actually spend your time doing and creating. Because I saw this post earlier, actually. It says, it was like, the first podcast episode you release probably isn't going to be that good. The first song you release probably isn't going to be that good. But you got to start somewhere. And don't compare yourself to others that you see online as well. Don't look at the success of others and think that's not attainable. It's not attainable yet, is the key, I think, with that. And also, what you see on social media isn't always reflective of actually what is happening. So just bear that in mind as well. But I think the big one there is, I think if you can find a mentor or maybe a community of musicians or producers that are supportive and will give you feedback and will give you advice, I think that is incredibly valuable. And don't spend hours watching, spend hours doing. That would probably be the other bit. Yeah.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. You've shared so much value. I thought this was really beneficial. So
No, my pleasure.
thanks so much for coming on and sharing with everyone. Be sure to check out Marc, his podcast, Inside the Mix. He also has a YouTube channel, so you can check him out there if you want to watch the podcast. And he's got some great tutorials as well. This has been awesome. Thanks for coming on, and we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, big thanks. I'll speak to you soon.
Hey, if you found this podcast valuable and you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit the like button and click subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes we release. And if you're listening on a podcasting platform, then it'd be a huge help if you could go ahead and leave a 5-star review, as this helps other independent music artists find this content in the future. And if you're hungry for more content that can help speed you past those sea monsters and storms on your music journey so you can reach your goals and live the dream, then be sure to click the video playing on the screen right now if you're watching on YouTube, as that will take you to a previous episode of this podcast that is chock full of value. With that, have an awesome day, keep creating, and I'll see you in the next episode.